Hello and welcome everyone to Liam's Lyceum. I'm your host, Liam, aka Himbar, and today I have a special video for you. This is actually a talk or presentation that I gave for a seminar series called Hallfred's Hall, and it is a series of talks. Every month there's one, right? And I just gave one in March of 2025 on Vikings. The focus is Vikings, early medieval Scandinavia, and just stuff related to Vikings in general. I will let you know down in the description how you can become involved in that if you want. If you want to participate in these monthly lectures, they're pretty prestigious. In fact, I'm pretty unprestigious compared to the other people, right, that are in there. We had Terry Barnes in January. We had Alex Harvey in February. Um, I think in April we're gonna have Zach Baker, I believe is his name, and then in May there's going to be Tom Horn. I believe later in the year Alex Wolf. So pretty like noteworthy people in Viking studies. And here I am. Um, but yeah, like I said, if you want to join, go down in the description. But today I did want to talk about what I spoke at for Halford's Hall, actually, and that is the earliest attestations of the word Viking and its cognates. Particularly, we're going to look at the Old English word witching. We're going to look at piracy, really just the semantics of it, so what it means. And then because of this, we're going to look kind of almost to conclude, we're going to go against a usage of the word Viking as an ethnonym. In fact, even when I was producing this in StreamYard, right, I went and I put the word Viking in the title of this video I'm recording right now, and it told me it was incorrect to put Viking without a V. Now, my phone doesn't go that far. My phone, if I type in Viking with a lowercase v, it autocorrects it with a capital V. I think this is just ridiculous. And a little absurd. That's actually what led me on the research to do to give this lecture, this present on this topic, and because I think that's a little silly. So now my phone doesn't say it's incorrect technically to be lowercase, but it does try to autocorrect it. So pretty much my idea was I made that observation, and then I also had this thought. If I had seen a few times online that people had said that the Old English word witching, which looks a lot like Viking, of course, actually comes from the Old Norse. Okay, and I was like, I don't believe that. So let's look into it and see what we come up with. Um, so my question then though was, where does that word Viking come from? First off, is it from Old Norse, even the Old English version? Is our modern version from Old Norse? And what does the word Viking mean? And really, that's the main focus here. Is we're gonna look a little bit at the coinings. We're gonna look at the etymology. We're gonna look at semantics largely, though. And so that first thing actually is the modern coining of the word Viking. Okay, so Viking, our modern word Viking does come from Old Norse. It comes from Old West Norse, and this is where it enters English right here. In 1801, Wikinger re-enters English in Sharon H. Turner's The History of the Anglo-Saxons. He suggested the second part of the word could be related to king, which is not just this 19th century guy mistaking Viking with the word king. Actually, this had happened in the medieval period as well. So it's a pretty old mistake, if you will, an old guess even. And here's what he says. He says, the name by which the pirates were at first distinguished was Vikingr, which perhaps originally meant kings of the bays. It was in bays that they ambushed to dart upon the passing voyager. And he uses the Old Norse version here as well, with that R on the end of the noun. And he even capitalizes it. Which is interesting. But he is, again, using the Old Norse version as well. And then with our modern version of Viking just comes not many years later in 1820. John Jameson, in his toponomastic notes to the Bruce by John Barbour, which is a medieval poem, we have it is most probably of Norse origin. He's talking about a place name and may have come from may have been corrupted from Vikingsfjord in the language that is still spoken in Iceland. Viking fjord would signify the sound or firth of the pirates or sea kings, the place where they were wont to land. So he also puts sea kings in here too. He makes this assumption about kings. And this toponomastic just means, again, it's a place name. So that he's talking about. And then usage as an ethnonym. So where we get our modern idea of Vikings, right? When we think of Viking studies, we're thinking of pretty much all of Scandinavia in the Middle Ages, right? Early Middle Ages or so. So about the High Middle Age period. And we're not thinking of just one specific group of people in this activity. And we're not really thinking of what they thought of the word Viking either, and what it even meant. So this is actually from a recent article by Alex Wolf. This Wolf article actually is only a couple months old. It came out early this year. He says Charles Francis Curie, who's the Vikings in Western Christendom 8789 to 8888, published in 1891, so 19th century, but several decades later, seems to have been the first book published in English to use Viking in something like the generic ethnographic sense that it has today. Here's a quote from that. This word actually, Viking, pops up a lot in this book when I went and did my research on it. But here's a quote from it. It says, "The Viking was no worse and no better than the society from which he sprang." Right. Well, one thing I think that's interesting to note actually that in Danish, Norwegian, and Swedish, the word Viking did not survive. Actually, the Middle Ages did not survive the early Middle Age period. It is actually the modern word Viking, because they do have the word Viking, is a borrowing from Old Norse in the 17th century and didn't really get popular until the 19th century, just like when the English word is popping up. In Icelandic, it actually seems to have stuck around longer, but largely as a personal name, Vikingur, which we will look at later, kind of as that's going to come up. Yes. So first, let's get into the etymology. People like these etymologies. That's where a lot of people go when they're getting into philology, and that's like where they stop. All right. I think that's fun and that's fine and that's interesting, but you can go much further than etymology. But I think it is a good place to start. In fact, I will say this: a lot of my research came from one article by Christine Fell. I'll reference it at the end, and then one book by Judith Jesch. And neither of them cover the etymology, if I'm remembering correctly. They only really go over the semantics. And they definitely don't cover the modern coining. So in Old Norse, we have this word wikingur. I should point out that in Old Norse, during the Viking Age is when this w became a v, and that's where we mostly think of. When you're going to learn Old Norse, you're almost certainly going to learn the wikingur. I study philology. I have this tendency to look at time and place and see how the language changes, or at least I think that's more interesting in a lot of ways. But it's also just how I'm taught in some ways. So Wikinger is how I'm normally going to say this. It stayed Wikinger. This W to V sound change is super common. Happened in German, happened in Latin, happened in some French stuff. It's very common. So, but it actually happened in the West way before it happened in the Eastern dialects of Old Norse. In fact, some of them never changed. They're still a W sound, as you would put it. So this first element, though, is weak, which is bay, inlet, or small fjord, something like that. Or it could potentially be from wikja, which is to move across a water. I'm not sure on the consensus on which one is more popular, but I'd say it'd probably be the top one. The second element, of course, is ingur, which is a suffix for nouns to signify derivation, belonging, habitation, etc. Right? It's pretty straightforward, I think, to an English speaker what ing means, because it's the same thing. So again, let's touch on that W to V, the shift that we have. One, because I think it's easier to see this related word in Old English. Okay, so and Elfdalian, for example, yeah, is that one of the dialects that still retains that W sound. It's rather conservative among the dialects, and Wikinger did enter Middle Irish as well, and you can see this in names like Higgins, O'Higgins, Kiggins, McGugan, and whatnot, which they come from the same source where we get the word Viking. I did want to briefly touch on the abstract noun in Old Norse, which really doesn't play that much a role in this presentation, but it is good to know. The word viking is abstract. So it means piracy as opposed to pirate, if we're going to put Viking that way, right? So instead of Viking, it is a Viking thing, kind of. So Viking activity. Just a heads up there. So now we have the Old English witching, which is where most of our focus is going to be on. One thing, like I said, it was important to me to note that the V-W sound, English is rather conservative as far as Germanic languages are even concerned, that we never really got rid of this W sound. It didn't become a V. And we still retain that. So you can see the relation if you have a Wikinger and a witching, they sound a bit more related. Now, the problem is actually is witching, the C in the middle in Old English doesn't actually tell us how it's said. If we know the etymology, we could guess, right? And presumably, since we know what Viking looks like in Old Norse, it's probably reaching, right? That's what it should sound like according to some Old English sound changes, right? It should be a ch, it should be palatalized. And but it doesn't necessarily help us because if it came from Old Norse, if people in England, Anglo-Saxons or whatever, they have all these Old Norse people, and they're like the Old Norse people show up and like, hey, we're the Vikings, and they're like, oh, okay, well, they're the Vikings or whatever. They probably wouldn't say. They probably would first off would say we're the Vikings, and then it was like, oh, they're the Vikings, right? So this could technically be Viking, okay, and the spelling wouldn't help us there. I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to show you why this is not correct. It is a witching, but it is similar that this first element is which again would come from a bide, small bay, creek, inlet, or whatever Proto-Germanic wico, same as Old Norse week. Or it could be from temporary encampment or camp from Proto-Germanic weeks in Latin vicus, and they just kind of combine together. The second element is ing, it's the same as ingr. So then for a proposed Proto-Germanic for Old Norse and Old English should be weaken gods. This asterisk that you see here and you see up here, they're asterisk words, which means they're not actually recorded anywhere. They are reconstructed based off of evidence we have from languages that we do have record of. So this may not be correct, but it probably is. There's a good example of this actually not turning out how we thought it would when the oldest attestation of Odin came up, I believe only a year or two ago, and it was not spelled how we thought it would be spelled. So, anyways, so again, like I said, witching is what it seems like it should be said. If it is from Old Norse, it would probably be wiking. So this is one thing, the first thing actually I want to briefly point before we get to the semantics of it, why we know it's witching. All right, why? Because Old Frisian, which is a really close language to Old English, they're part of the Anglo-Frisian branch of the North Sea Germanic stuff of the West branch of the Germanic languages, and so really similar in a lot of ways. Now the thing about Old Frisian, kind of like Old Norse, is that it's written down later. So one of the reasons I want to cover the Old English is because it actually gives us the earlier attestations, right? This word, as far as I'm aware, doesn't survive anywhere in Gothic, which is really the only, besides some runic inscriptions, is really the only, and I don't think it survives in any old like Elder Futhark inscriptions either. It's the only older language than Old English, really. Old English is attested really early. Because the Anglo-Saxons converted really early and they wrote down stuff really early. So, and they weren't opposed to using their own language. A lot of times, or sometimes in Europe, people convert, but then they always almost write in Latin or whatever. English didn't have that problem until the Middle English period, pretty much. So we have a relative word, the North Sea relative word. The language closest to English is Frisian. The Old Frisian word is witching. And it's spelled differently. You can tell there's different orthographic rules. Witsing or Wising. Witching, different time, region, depending, dialect here, the spelling you'd get. And so it has that palatalized medial K or K, like Old English witching, right? Frisian law, again, written down later, 13th century or whatnot. But one of the examples we have is Fonte Norda witching, which is by Northern Vikings, right? And if they have this palatalization, we know based off how it's spelled, okay, for them, because it doesn't have that ambiguity that Old English C does, for example, then we know Old English has that palatalization. Even without the evidence, that's the philological evidence in a sense, or the reconstructive evidence. But we have evidence of the text itself, so this is going to help us. This information about Old Frisian, of course, comes from Wolf Bremer. He's like the premier Old Frisian scholar. So now we need to get into the elephant in the room, as that says in Old English right there. And what does witching or wikinger actually mean? We've touched on it a little bit. It seems to be connected to pirate, but it's not 100% clear. At least in etymology, doesn't really tell us much. A bay dweller, I guess, an inlet dweller. So yeah. Anyways. This is largely going to focus on witching, like I said, because of the reasons of these are older attestations. And it's just easier for me. I study Old English. But also because of dating reasons. But also because of that dating reasons, we're mostly going to look at the prose We're going to look at the prose first. Now we are going to look at the poetry because this word really doesn't show up that much. I can exhaust the Old English list of witching. I literally can. And that's what we're going to do. It's going to be an exhaustive exploration, everybody. But that's how not often this word is used because I can go over all of them. The poetry I go second because the dating for poetry is a lot more inconclusive. I mean, it depends on who you ask, and I have some opinions, but in this case, I'm being neutral. I'm gonna go in the middle of the road. But so the Old Norse sources, we will look at them a little later, but not as in depth. I don't want to bore you guys to death. But I can tell you for further reading if you want to bore yourself to death, which is a joke because I read the book anyways. So anyways, the oldest attestations of witching is actually in glossaries. And they're all related to each other. You know, the Epinal glossary was copied for the Effort glossary or whatnot. But this one, 7th century, very early. Okay, that is very early. And we have a glossary, which is just Latin words with the Old English word right next to them. Super helpful on telling us what these words mean. Okay, we have piraticum in the Latin, which means pirate, and then we have wicing shaidan, which means Viking scather. What does Viking mean exactly? Viking here doesn't necessarily tell us that much, besides the fact that it's probably related to the sea somehow, right? We know pirates are sea criminals pretty much, right? Then scathers are bad, right? Scathers, shada, has a sense of enemy, ravager, robber. Viking doesn't really tell us a lot just on this alone. The whole compound is a negative, but it doesn't really tell us much besides that. By the way, to answer any confusion, the modern word scathe comes from Old Norse, which has that ska. The Old English word shav is Old English, and the sc again parallelized, so it's sha. And there is no modern English word shaith, but it technically would mean the same thing. They have the exact same meaning. We just have our pronunciation more so getting it from the Old Norse. So anyways, that is the first attestation. Then we have the Effort glossary, also from the 7th century. And we have piraticum, which the word has become abstract. It doesn't mean pirate anymore. It means piracy. And it is glossed as wicing shadai. You can tell here there's some interesting orthographic things that are not quite like the later orthographic rules. You actually have a literal W, this D instead of like an ev. And later you get actually less of an actual W. You get a win, which looks a lot like a P, but when you put it in modern context, you normally just write it as a W to not confuse you so much. So any of these actual W's are almost certainly wins in Old English sources. But win is a rune, again, like I said, that looks a lot like a P. So we don't really use it. We don't use it in modern English. So, but again, we have this pretty much the same thing. We have scather or scathing, I guess, and witching, which again doesn't really tell us much if witching is a negative inherently. It could just be sea scather, like a sailor scather, even, or something like that, right? So the whole concept here is negative, but it doesn't tell us much. We have the corpus glossary that comes from the 8th century. Again, pretty much the same thing. We have pratikam, it's wicing shadan. Okay, we're not getting a lot of information from these first ones, but we are getting some because of what we know from the 7th century is this is before any Viking incursions. So we know right then and there that this word is not of Old Norse origin. It's almost certainly a common Germanic origin, right? That Old Norse and Old English get it from the same place rather than Old English getting it from Old Norse. And we know that, right? Because 7th century is too early for these Viking incursions. So it does tell us that, and it does have it seems to be combined for a negative. Whether in of itself the word Viking is negative remains to be seen, but we will see in a second. So we have some later attestations. Well, in the 10th century, we have pratici, which is glossed as three things. Actually, it's glossed as wicing shadan again. So again, not telling us much. Sai shadan and ashman. So a sai shadan is a sea scather. So again, the sea is negative, is not native, right? It's not inherently negative. So again, a sea scather, and then an ashman. And ashman is just pretty much a boat person. The ash is a type of boat, as opposed to like a spear or the ash tree in Old English in this case. And it is a kind of common word, actually. In fact, ashman, if I remember correctly, is where the modern Italian word for Viking comes from. It's still ascomano or something like that. So But we do have another gloss as well. We have archipirata, which is glossed as ha sai theof, which is ha, I see thief. Ha is a very common translation of arch from Latin. You have like hal angel for archangel rather, or hal father for patriarch or something like that. But is literally high sea thief, this arch pirate. Again, we're not learning much about witching here, but we are learning about some ideas of what we get for pirates and what they think of pirates. Like Ashman, we know that they're being named after a type of boat. And then in the 11th century, we have archipirata, which we learn is floatman or witching. And here's an interesting one. It's witching. It's not witching shadan. It's witching. Just a word, witching. What's interesting here, though, actually, is both of these words still give us a little bit of confusion, right? These are not floatman and witching, really archipirata. It's not like high floatman. It's not the chiefest of floatman. It's not the chiefest of witchings. No, it's just they're both giving us negative words here. But I can tell you right now that floatman's not always negative. You look it up online, oftentimes it just tells you it's pirate. It just means pirate, but it's not really true. In fact, if I remember correctly, Noah in the Hexateuch is described as a floatman. He's not a pirate, and that's not negative. And so floatman literally means float person. Man in Old English means person rather than having any uh, uh, like gender role to it. It just means person. It doesn't mean actual like a guy. And so it just means sailor. It means a mariner, strictly speaking, but it often is used for a pirate. And witching obviously has a negative meaning here too, because it's again a gloss for archipirata, which is negative. It's arch pirate. But it's the first time it's not really attached to anything, which is interesting. So still related to pirates. It also is the second option here. Floatman is the first one. And then we have, in the 11th century, we have archipirata, which is Ildis witching, which means oldest Viking literally, but chief Viking, right? So we have the same thing, like going back, right? We just had archipirata as witching, but this time we actually have the Ildis witching would be archipirata. So that is inherently a negative then, right? That we have witching as a negative, right? It is a pirate. This is what a witching is, it's a pirate. And an archi one is the chief one. So we have pirata, piraticus, and chilex are witching or shaithman. So again, witching inherently negative, right? Because it's being compared to pirates. Shaithman, though, is an interesting one because this one seems to be a Norse reference. Okay, speaking about Norse subjects and not just pirates in general. Okay, Shaithman is first gloss evidence connecting pirata and Norse raiders. But Alfrich in his grammar in the 10th century, so not much before this, actually glosses pirata with witching oder Shaithman. So again, pirate, inherently negative as witching, or Shaithman. So Shaithman, again, like Ashman, is a type of ship. It comes from Old Norse Skaith, which is a type of ship, a type of big ship. And this is well, of course, after the start of Norse raids in England at this point. But we definitely have a word associated with the Norse at this point. And so now we're going to turn away from glosses and we're going to look at the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. And that is, well, it's a history, obviously written by the Anglo-Saxons. And it's actually only mentioned 5 times in the whole Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. I don't know if you can tell that means that this word is not that popular. It shows up in our glosses, but it's really not that popular of a word. It's not that popular of a word to denote Vikings. What we would normally call Vikings these days are almost never called Vikings in Old English. And we're going to see that it's going to become even more clear, right? Now that we don't just have glosses, which doesn't give you much context, we're going to get more actual sentences, pretty much. So anyways, so it occurs 5 times, one in 879, twice in 885, once in 917, and once in 982. So in 879, or 880 in the C text, we have Her for Sehera to Chirin Chastra of Chipinhama and sat there on winter. And the Irkanjera ye gadroden on Hlot Wichinga, and ye sat at Fulenhama betemesa. Which here's my translation for you. It says, here the army went to Chirinchester from Chippenham and sat there one winter, and that year a gang of pirates gathered and sat at Fulham by the Thames. So one thing I want to point out first is that chloth is not a common word, actually. It only appears once more in the chronicle at all, so it is very uncommon, just like witching, and it largely is only found in law code, and it means band of criminals. Definitely has a sense of criminality, right? This, yeah, regardless of how you just choose to translate it. But it definitely, in this sense, is signaling out these witching gods. If you note, there's actually two separate things here. They're detached. They're not connected to each other. We have talk of a hera, not to be confused. Her means here, and hera, which looks exactly like modern English here, is army. Okay, like Hereward or um, Harold or something like that. So um, and Hera tends to denote Scandinavian invaders in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, rather than other nationalities, while the word ship Hera can really denote anyone, just as ship army, right? So what we have here, though, is here the army went to Cirencester from Chippingham and sat there one winter, and in that year, not related to this army, okay, a gang of pirates gathered and sat at Fulham by the Thames. Okay, they're not related to this army. They're pirates. They're off doing their own thing. Okay, they just so happen in the same year. Hey, and then in 885 we have Sona Swa hi common on stura mudan da je muten hi 16 shipu wichinga an witha je fuchtun an tha shipu alo je chreton an tha menos slochon da hi tha ham ward winden mit thare cher Dda je metan hir mitjana shipchera wichinga, and with ye fuchtun, the irkandaya, and dda danishan achtonsia. I should note these things that look like sevens are a Turonian note. That is the Turonian et, which means and. It's and or owned in Old English. So anyway, immediately as they came into the mouth of the Stour, they met 16 Viking ships, and against them fought, and the ships captured, and the men slew. I translated this very literally to help you if you decided to read the Old English. When they were going homeward with their booty, then they met a great ship army of pirates and fought with them the same day, and the Danish owned the victory. So this again seems to be two things, right? So we have 16 Viking ships, which seems to be a local ship hera. Viking ships, these are probably like East Anglians or whatever, or whatever they're fighting against the people of Wessex, and when they were going home, this they had to fight more. They had to fight another ship army, and the Danes win. So the Vikings in this case are definitely associated with Danes. Okay, um, that's what we got, right? And the Danes won, unfortunately for the Anglo-Saxons, right? So it seems to be a local ship hera, like I said, and the main hera having moved away, it is associated with the Danes. So that is something. 917 we have Tha after Tham, Tha Yit, Thas Irkan Harvestis, Ega Doroda Mitchell Hina of Astenglum, either ye Thas Lan Heres, ye Thara Wichinga, de Hia Him to Fultama Aspanen Havdon, ye Fliumdon, Thona Hera of Hera an Oslohon, Hira Moni Hun, either ye Ashmana, ye Odra. I skipped a little bit here mostly so I could show you Ashmana and use here. But then after the same, and then after yet the same harvest is gathering, a great army from the East Angles built the land army and the Vikings, which they enticed to have them help put to flight the army and slayed their many hundreds, both shipmen and others. So one thing that's interesting here is that the East Angles were in the Danelaw at this point, but they're not called Danes, first off, which is interesting. This is only in the A text, by the way. But we have two aspects of the Hera. One is the Land, Hada, right? That's how it's spelled here, Langeres. And then there's the Wichinga, which had to be enticed to help the Hera. They're not part of the Hera. They're separate. Okay, maybe they're all from Denmark back home, right? But they're not part of this Hera. They're not serving under some foreign ruler, right? To maybe in fact they're even local to the East Anglia. But anyways, so again, separate. It's not this witching gods are not denoted by any national label. And then 982 we have Her on this yara kommen upp under satum three shipu wichinga and Her Goden on Portlanda the Irkan yara forban London Bury. So here in the year came upon Dorset three Viking ships and harried in Portland. In the same year they burned London. So these these Vikings did both of these things. They harried in Portland and burned London. Um, but it's separate from any North Shipherra here. There are no Danes. There's just Vikings doing their own thing. Okay, so there's no connotations besides the fact that these are pirates. That's about it. That's all we know, right? For all we know, these pirates could have been from some, like the Mediterranean. I don't know, like that's probably not the case, right? But there's no real context to tell us that there's any associations besides the fact that they're pirates. All right, so then in Athelward's Chronicon, Athelward's a pretty cool guy. He's a historian. He is actually the patron of Alfred of Ensham. But he actually kind of supports these English uses, which is to say, he doesn't write Paraticum really at all, actually, in his writing. So if Paraticum is to witching, witching doesn't show up very often, right? So in his Chronicon, he is translating the Anglo-Saxon into Latin, okay? And he prefers the terms pagani, which would connect to the Old English heathen, which just means heathen. And then he also has excurtus danorum, which is just an army of the Danes, pretty much, right? Which would connect us to Hera, like we talked about before, and it also connects us to Dana, which is another word that just means Dane, but is another word that they just really used for anyone, regardless if they're from Denmark or not, that was a Scandinavian invader. And they also commonly use the word Northman. These terms are much more common than the word witching, right? Northman, Dana, and Heathen. The reason I didn't capitalize these is because they're not capitalized in Old English. Anyways, so as Fell tells us here, Scandinavians are only occasionally witching us, and that when they are witching us, this is in no way a distinction by nationality. It is a distinction of a group of paratai from Excurtus. Okay, and I think that's been made pretty clear at this point, right? Okay, the pirates and the Excurtus or Hera or army or whatever are not the same. They're not treated the same. And I think it's become obvious that the fact that I covered every prose word or every prose usage for witchinga or witching at this point, that it's not a very common word. So let's get into some of the poetry real quick. Again, hard to date some of these poems, but this is probably from around the year 900. It may make sense with how it pertains to Alfred the Great's reign, but this refers to pirates in the Mediterranean. Twice in the text, the word witching is used, and once in a chapter heading. So we have the original Latin here, paraticam ad agressus est, and then the Old English, he shipa gadroda an witchingas wordan, which I translated both of these. The Latin pretty strictly says took to piracy, and then the English says they became a ship gathering and pirates. So, but this is talking about pirates in the Mediterranean, so there's no sense of Scandinavia here, right, or Northmen. And then also, in the sections, as the Old English Orosius has sections on Ochtera and Wolstan, and their travels in Scandinavia, there's not a single use of the word witching at all in that section. So, anyways, that is our first poetry piece. And then we have Exodus, the Old English Exodus. This one is, again, some of these are a little confounding because we have the tribe of Reuben referred to as Sai Vikings, which is sea Vikings, right? Almost certainly not a negative. I don't know why they would describe it as a negative. So, Randas baron Sai Vikings over Saltnemersh is the excerpt, and I just translated that for you. And it says, their shields, the sea rovers, sea sailors, sea merit or something, a little redundant, but the tribe of Reuben, right? Because that's who it's denoting, carried over the salty marsh, right? So maybe a neutral sense again in this case, kind of like flotmon, right? Which just means sailor or mariner, but can mean pirate and often does. So interesting. Again, then we have the Battle of Malden, which is a battle fought against what we'd call Viking forces, but in reality is more of a Hera. On the 10th or 11th of August in 991. The poem itself has to be from after this point. It may be from the reign of Canute, which would be relatively shortly after this. And the word Viking actually appears 6 times in the poem, which is very interesting. It's a lot. And they all refer to the English foes, the Northmen, which is also interesting because that doesn't happen very often, that you have strictly calling the Northmen witching us, right? It happened once, really strictly speaking, in a in the Chronicle. So here's one excerpt I took from lines 26, 27. It says, Sta stor on staida, stith licha klipoda, wichinga ar, word malda. So then stood on the shore, strongly calling a Viking herald, word speaking. So the Danes are strictly called Vikings in this case. Now, this is if it's Canute, who would have some Danish connections, of course. His name is Canute, and if you know Canute, then you know Canute. I don't need to get into it right now, but that this is still enemy of the Anglo-Saxons, though these Viking forces, as it says here, and so it'd be a negative thing. It is a negative thing. The English are the good guys in this case, right? When you read the poem, but it seems like maybe it's an early example of romanticization by these Danes of this word Viking. We're going to see that's really not the word they prefer, though. The Vikings don't really want to be called Vikings. So, anyways, then we have Widsith, heavily debated on when it could be composed. The oldest study of Widsith is called Widsith, a study, and I'm blanking on who wrote it. It was over 100 years ago. But Chambers, that's who it was, R.W. Chambers. I knew him from my Tolkien-related stuff. But this poem is old. Okay, it almost certainly is old. I would agree with that old dating. It seems to be, in fact, that it might have been partially composed at least in the 6th century, which is early. That's earlier than that first glossary. And that's because there doesn't seem to be an English or an Anglo-Saxon identity. It seems to be more of this tribal continental identity. So this would have been shortly after migration and before any of these kingdoms decided to call themselves Anglo-Saxons or English or anything like that. This would have still been during when they're pretty much the petty kings are still around, right? It'd be very early, right? And the Widsith is an interesting poem because it means like far traveler. There has been a nice article by Leonard Nydorf recently, if I'm remembering correctly, that kind of connects this to a Woden figure, an Odin figure, where Widsith seems like he might be an Odin type figure as one. He goes through these courts, and these rulers die hundreds of years apart, so that can't actually be a physical person. Okay, it's very heroic. Keeps on a lot of the traditions that you'll see in later sagas being written. But also, a lot of these people, a lot of these courts end up with tragedy, end up in disaster, like ancient Germanic poems love. Okay, but also seems like something that maybe the frenzied one would incite, right, or bring about. So if you like Woden, I definitely recommend you reading Widsith and studying that for yourself. It is an interesting poem, but it also gives us really two interesting attestations of the word Viking, actually, because they don't really make much sense as far as I can tell. We have Wichinga kin, or kin, technically, in reference to the Hathobards. They're Vikingkin. I don't know if that's supposed to be an insult to the Hathobards. I'm not really sure. And then we have Midwinlam, ich was und Midwarnum und Midwichingum. So Wichingum seems like it should be a capital W here, right? Because Winlam are the Vandals. We know the Vandals are. And then the Warnum are the Warni, who are, again, another historical tribe. But the Wichingum, I'm not aware of that tribe. So capital V Vikings, I guess. I'm not sure. Doesn't really seem negative, but it doesn't really make a lot of sense either. Maybe it's there for alliteration purposes. So, anyways, and then we have that's it. That's the poetry actually. So we're gonna cover. I believe this is the last thing. This is prose. I guess I probably should have put it earlier, but I don't know why I put it here. Anyways, and then we're going to have one more attestation, which is really not in Old English. It's in Latin, but it from a word. Anyway, so we have Sermo Lupi ad Anglos, which is a sermon of the wolf against, or to the Angles, by Wulfstan II, called himself, the wolf in Latin. The homily itself is written in Old English. This is the most famous homily. But this is what he says. Klaverder at Glape and of Christendom Towichinga Wertha. So, and again, I translate this as though a thrall which will escape from his lord and from Christendom to become a Viking. So it's very a negative thing. It's very much negative, right? And because why would you want to escape Christendom and your lord? to become a Viking. So Viking, obviously, just a occupation in this case. It means piracy, right? Pretty much become a pirate. Um, what is interesting, I mean, being Archbishop of York, which would be in the Danelaw, the word thrala is thrall, but it is an Old Norse word. We would Old English had different words for slave, which were not thrala, and they don't really look like thrala either. And so that is showing some Norse influence. Or for all I know, Wolston said this word wirkinga, right? But he probably didn't. We've seen the word wichinga is already around for a while. And so then now we can finally look at, and since I don't want to completely exhaust you or exhaust myself, I'm not going to go through all the examples in Old Norse. I will briefly touch on them here, though. And if you do want to read all those examples in Old Norse, the semantics of it, it's going to be exhaustive. And this book actually covers a lot more than just the word Viking. But Ships and Men, the Late Viking Age by Judith Jesch, it does cover the word Viking. It does go over a lot more, though. It is a good book if you can get a hold of it and want to read it. But the preferred term would be drengr, which kind of means a valiant, a gallant, or a bold person, or a youthful person. There is a cognate in English, just dreng. But this was the term preferred for someone going a vikingu, or a Viking, right? And vikingur would be perceived as a negative, right? It seems. By time the sagas are written, it is likely more on a romantic and a more positive note. But at the time, in the Viking Age, drengr would have been much preferred over Viking. And I would say even when I read like um uh what's the word? Like historical fiction. I people seem to get this right, that the word drengr shows up a lot more than the word Viking does. So Vikingur itself in runic inscriptions appears in the singular only in personal names, and the plural usages are ambiguous. Runes are hard. They're difficult. One, because they're hard to date. Carvings on stone are hard to date. Something like the switching from elder Futhark to younger Futhark does help us. So these younger Futhark ones we can learn. There's a good chance they're going to be coming from the Viking Age, and not from something earlier. But they're also hard to date, and also you don't get a lot of context from them because one, they're just a mess. If you read any runic inscriptions, a lot of them are just super messy, but they're also super short, right? They don't give you much really to work with, and I mean, which makes sense. Carving runes onto stone wouldn't be very easy. The runic inscriptions do tell us some things, right? Like that personal name, Vikingr, just like I said, it survives in Icelandic today as Vikingr. Um, uh, but in the plural usage, they're really just ambiguous. It's really hard to gather what the word could even really mean as far as like connotation is concerned. In Skaldic verse, actually, though, it is only in the plural. There is no singular usage of the word Viking, and the sense is a pejorative. It is a pejorative to describe your enemy. So the romantic shift itself away from this pejorative sense seems to take place again, kind of like Crawford said up here in the first paragraph, in the late 11th century. The runic inscriptions again can be difficult to date precisely, but there are earlier evidence, right? And the Skaldic stuff is more after the Viking Age has actually already happened, right? In the 12th and 13th centuries are being written down about events that have happened in the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries. And so hard to get into. You can get in all the nitty gritty though in Jesh's book if you want to go into like Skallagrimson's saga, Egil Skallagrimson's saga, I should say, and get into that. But we pretty much have our conclusion. One thing that I want to look at here is Adam Bremen in his famous work. This guy is from Germany. Is Gesta Hammerburgensis Ecclesiae Pontificum in the late 11th century text. He is saying this. The context is that the Danes, the context is about betraying the king, and follows a description of crimes and their respective punishments. These are crimes. Okay, they're bad things, and concerning the Danish king, even right. So the Danish king thought that pirates were bad, right? He says, "Piratai quos ili vikingos appellant nostri ascomanos." So pirates whom they call Vikings, which is interesting. The spelling here, vikingos. Not sure. This could just be a failure of Latin. The ch in Latin is a mess. Like the Old English hialak, or well, I guess it'd be Proto-Germanic, but it comes off of Huculaicus or something like that in Latin. It's terrible. So beware your ch here. It's just, this probably coming from like a huh, or something like that, which is interesting spelling still, but definitely does have the W. So you can recognize Vikingos as Vikings, right? And who we call Askomanos, right? Which is another word we discussed earlier, the Ashman. And so it's a negative, right? The Danish king thought the word Viking was a negative, right? That's what they call them, these pirates, Vikingos. Um, so there you have it. I feel like that's pretty conclusive at this point. So the takeaways, what do we got? Okay. I think the Old English term is pretty strictly speaking and pretty obviously at this point is not a loan from Old Norse. You should be saying as wicing and not as viking. And it normally has a pejorative sense. It seems to mean pirate, which is not a nice occupation. And it has no inherent ethnic or national connotations, though it can sometimes have some national uses. It doesn't. It's not inherent. It only is really occupational. It is an uncommon word. It's not used very often, and particularly when referring to Norse raiders, other words are preferred. Other labels preferred, like Northman and Dana and Heiden and Hera in case of other things, right? So very much not common. In Old Norse, it also tends to have a pejorative sense until Romanticization in the late 11th century. It still would drop out of use in all these Norse languages besides Icelandic, though. It is not an ethnic term. It never is used as an ethnic term, besides in that one weird line in a in Widsith, but not in Old Norse, at least it isn't. And it is an uncommon word, just like it is in Old English. Other words are preferred over it. In particular, when you're speaking about a positive sense, when we would say Vikings, they would say drengr, right? So what are we gonna do now? So hopefully my phone stops autocorrecting Viking, and elsewhere, like on StreamYard, they say they will correct themselves and tell me that Viking with a lowercase v is a correct word. And then I think we can find some more nuance in how we treat our modern English word and the studies associated with it. I think of a couple things, right? I think of the International Society for Anglo-Saxonists, right? Changed their name a handful of years ago now to the International Society for the Study of Early Medieval England. Now, I'm not going to say that Anglo-Saxon is a useless term. I use it a couple times here. But I think more nuance is given when you say International Society for the Study of Early Medieval England. And even though it's much more of a mouthful, it's more accurate, right? In that sense, right? Because that's what the society actually is more accurately about. And I think the same thing with Viking, right? I think the word Viking has its uses. It definitely grabs people's attention. Okay. But it was not really a word they used very often. It was not a positive thing. It's just not it's pretty much like this, right? If the Vikings roll up into England and the first people they see are monks, right? Okay. And they're like, "Ah, yes, monks. I don't know what they're gonna call them, papas maybe, or or whatever." Mooks. And they're like, "Ah, yes." And so now every time in Scandinavia today, when they're talking about English history, particularly early medieval English history, they're like, "Ah, yes, let us study the priests." Does that make any sense? That doesn't make any sense. Okay. Particularly, it'd be even worse, right? Because it wouldn't even be like priest, because priest is like a fine word. The English would be like okay with that, but the Viking word would be is negative, right? So it'd be like, oh yeah, let's call them like the I don't know the sad little celibate men or something. Even though a lot of them do celibate, so I don't know, right? Just like think of a negative, and then think that's what we're gonna call them. And then in modern studies, that's what we're gonna call it, right? Like that doesn't make any sense. Okay, so I think Viking has its usage. I think it's used way too liberally, and definitely usage as an ethnonym doesn't really make any sense. Okay, and I hope that's pretty obvious from the little bit we've gone over. If you do have any thoughts, like I said, I still think there's usage. There is still good usages for the word Viking. I still think it's useful. I just think nuance, especially when you're talking about academic things, you want to be as accurate and precise as possible. And I think that getting away from capitalizing something like Viking where we can is really going to help. And I think that's simple. And if you want, these are my sources. Again, Rolf Bremer, Jackson Crawford. His video really mostly points to Judith Jesch's book. And then Christine Fell and Judith Jesch are my biggest sources for this. Then we have of course, the other things I looked at mostly at the beginning. So and I pulled Anglo-Saxon Chronicle from this online website. So, anyways, I hope you enjoyed this. I am again Liam Cutie Hall, if you will, and I am a budding philologist, spine philologist, but I do videos here. And again, if you want to participate in Halford's Hall, I will have something down for you to potentially sign up for the mailing list, newsletter, or whatever for Halford's Hall, so you can join us. I'm hoping this video will come out in early April, and so hopefully you'll be able to even join us in April because I know the one in April is on April 13th. So, anyways, Liam from Liam's Lyceum. Thank you. I'll catch you next time.